Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. So, as some of you know, I was in New York for a couple days for a birthday trip for my lovely wife, and through all sorts of logistical snafus and whatnot, we are recording this. Normally, we record the second episode of the week on Wednesdays. But instead, we're doing this without a net on Thursday morning and pump it out same day. I just thought I should give you that context so you know what's going on. Also, because I don't know what I'm going to talk about yet, and want to give myself a chance to think. And we figured we needed somebody who could come in at a moment's notice and talk about anything. I also had a abiding interest in finding someone more curmudgeonly and misanthropic than myself, and that is a very narrow crawl space. But we've managed to do it by bringing in our own Kevin Williamson, a dispatch writer, longtime friend, author of many fine books, and the father of what is shaping up to be a very large dynasty. Kevin, welcome back to the Remnant.
Yeah, 2 years ago, no kids. Now 4.
Yeah.
It's
how's all that going?
It's good. They're mostly cheerful, entertaining, amusing little bunch of gentlemen. They're loud. There's I tell my wife sometimes that there's a reason I lived alone till I was 46 years old, and part of that is just that I'm not good with people, but no, they're great. They're fun. And my wife, of course, does most of the hard stuff at this point. She's the one who's getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to feed the triplets and whatnot. And I just try to write stuff and earn a living and contribute in that way. But they're fun though. The older boy is just under 2, and so he's talking and playing with stuff, and he's building houses with his magnetiles and blocks, and he's very definite about what he wants. When he's done with his dinner, he puts his stuff down and he says bath, and so we take him off to the bath. And when he doesn't want something, he says no in a very definitive kind of way. And he's a good kid. You've met him a couple times.
Yeah. And he's
a hoot.
And I say this with all the kindness and generosity in my heart imaginable. You're really lucky how much he takes after his mother. And because he was just a cheery when I met him. I mean, we're not using names here, but like he was such a unbelievably smiley, cheery, hey, how's it going kind of baby. And that's not, if I was going to describe you, like when someone asks, what's Kevin Williamson really like, those are not the kinds of adjectives I would use about you, but they are the kinds of adjectives I would use about your wife, who's really lovely and charming and outgoing, and
it's good balance. And the little babies are very smiley at this point too. They've just started the smiling thing. I mean, they'll make random faces when they're real little, but they're now where they'll smile and giggle in response to things, which is kind of fun. So
what would you say your total volume of diapers a week or a month is, like, if you had to guess?
So okay, we're in 2 different sizes, of course.
Right.
So the smaller ones, I guess we do a box a day. And the larger ones, I don't know. It's I can tell you that the local municipal services here will not haul off the volume of recycling we produce. So I have to actually load stuff up in the truck, which I will do today at some point, and take it to the dump and get rid of it. So that's just diaper boxes and things. And it's a banal observation, I guess, in many ways, but I'll make it anyway, that it's just so much easier to do this right now than it would have been 20 years ago because of things like Amazon.
For sure.
But also because of other things. Like we were talking about this yesterday, that there was some little thing my wife was trying to figure out how to do. I don't remember what it was. Something she had to put together. And she's good at putting stuff together. She's an architect.
Right.
And but she didn't know how to do it. And she looked it up in some 1 minute and 30-second video on YouTube and figured that stuff out. But No, it's just so easy to have this stuff delivered. And, formula, we go through just massive amounts of formula.
I bet.
We have more babysitters than I can remember their names. So we, there's some logistical issues there, and some resource investment, I guess.
So, on the point about the recycling and them not taking all of it, just staying on the theme of dealing with giant bags of crap. Let's talk about the Biden administration's decision.
I thought we were talking about the Peter Mitchell story instead. Actually, that's something else I want to talk about.
We can do that too. I mean, I just figured we will. We
you were in New York. What show did you go see?
We saw Tommy.
Tommy. Do you like Tommy?
So I have not seen the original, film probably straight through ever. And if I had, it's been 40 years or something like that. Right. So like I remembered very little of it. I'm not the music guy that my wife, like my wife can talk B-sides and stuff and all that kind of thing and is really into music and all that. So she loved it. I liked it. I like the energy, like just the sort of, I'm always marvel that these people can do this, 7 or 8 times a week, just in terms of the sheer commitment of it. And I like going to the productions. I like doing the math about how much money people are spending on theater. Like there's a lot of just event stuff I think is really interesting, but
it's less than you would think. I think ticket sales like $1 billion a year in New York, something like that.
Is that it?
It seems seems like it should be more.
It does, given how unbelievably expensive tickets are, and how packed these places are, like on a Tuesday night, But I can't say that like I absolutely loved it. I enjoyed it. It was a fun night, but like, I think. Have you seen it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so I think one of the mistakes they make is like the choreography is impressive. Okay, yeah. So the choreography is impressive. There's a lot of dancing to it, and I always have a little bit of that sort of squeeziness of not liking crowds feeling, of seeing people dance that makes me a little uncomfortable. But since the music is so central to the whole thing, I think they kind of made a mistake not like figuring out a way to have people playing. If they're doing the real singing, they should have been able. You should have figured out a way to have people doing the real guitar playing at least on stage, so you can see it. They do have a band, but you don't see it. It's an orchestra pit, right? And I just think that like given the guitar, how central the guitar stuff is in the Who, having someone on stage, doing the full Pete Townsend kind of thing and the windmill arm, I think. Given how much nostalgia is built into going to see Tommy in the first place, because it's like. We brought down the average age probably in that room, my wife and I. Sure. And so I thought I have questions about the production, but overall I liked it.
Yeah, I saw a production of a play. It was when I was still doing theater criticism. It's called Lysistrata Jones, and it's kind of like a college musical thing. It's an adaptation of Lysistrata. And it's really obviously supposed to be a high school musical, but there's a bunch of sex stuff in it, so they put it at a college instead to deal with the age issues. But they had the band on a kind of a catwalk above the stage, and I thought that worked. I thought that worked pretty nicely.
Yeah, there's a little of that in Hadestown, which I saw, which you see the music's incorporated more into the actual production.
Bloody Andrew Jackson was pretty good about. They had the band on the stage, and they just sort of had them around where the dramatic part of the action was going on. And they could kind of, fade into the background when they weren't doing something and then kind of come into the foreground when they were. I thought that worked pretty well. So I like The Who in general. I'm kind of I'm a guitar player, so I'm a fan of Pete Townsend's style of guitar playing. That, kind of angular, rhythmic way he has playing guitar. Although he's an interesting guy as a writer and as a composer. I think he's done some other very non-Who stuff over the course of his career, particularly in the 80s when he was making, All the Best Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes and that stuff, which I think is still pretty fun to listen to, although maybe there's an element of nostalgia there as well.
Who do you think holds up better today, the Who or the Rolling Stones?
Oh, I think the Rolling Stones probably, because I suppose the youth slang, the word basic has gotten a bad reputation, but there's something basic about the Rolling Stones music that it's.
Mm-hmm.
So the Rolling Stones wander a lot. The Who wanders a lot further away from the blues than the Rolling Stones do.
Fair.
And
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Rolling Stones, even when they're doing, French horns and stuff, tend to sit in that kind of, 1-4-5 pentatonic scale, traditional kind of world. And that stuff, because it is sort of elemental, ends up having a more timeless quality, I think. So I think that 100 years from now, if people want to know what the middle of the 20th century sounded like, they'll listen to things like Honky Tonk Women
Mm-hmm.
more than they would Bob O'Reilly.
Yeah. I will say that, like, I prefer the Who over the Rolling Stones in that if you're just doing greatest hits, I enjoy listening to the Who's greatest hits probably more than I do the
Mm-hmm.
Rolling Stones greatest hits. But I'm not sure that makes the Who the better band. But this is way outside of my comfort zone.
I probably prefer listening to the Who, but the Stones are a lot more fun to play.
I can see that.
If you were in a band and you had to do like a 90-minute show, it would be a lot more fun to play a bunch of Rolling Stone songs than Who songs.
All right, since we're just sort of indulging casual two middle-aged men sitting around schmoozing stuff, let's go to that Cleta Mitchell thing that you mentioned. So I sent you this thing this morning.
Yeah.
There's a piece in the New York Times by David Farentold, who I generally trust. The headline is Pro-Trump Nonprofit Paid Millions to Companies Tied to Its Own Leaders. The subhead is The Conservative Partnership Institute's 3 highest paid contractors had connections to the group's leaders or their relatives, raising concerns about self-dealing. And one of the characters in this story is this woman, Cleta Mitchell, that we have strong views about. We can get to that in a second. But just sort of to level set, I've had this view for a little while now because I've heard similar stories about other conservative institutions that have gone Trumpy, and when they move in Trumpy people, they tend, CPAC is an obvious example.
They loot the places.
Yeah, they loot the places. I know of one organization, I won't name it because I don't want to get into legal stuff, but like they very deliberately refused to put something out for a bid because they wanted it to go to the wife of one of the people on the board. And the thing about it is, this is, as you were one of the few people out there that I will concede you know this better than I do, this is a very old tale, this kind of thing. But it is there's a weird intellectual consistency to devotees of industrial policy, and sort of corporatist, economics doing this, because the whole idea about sort of industrial policy is basically machine politics. Let's give stuff to our friends. They just announced in New York State, I think it's going to get thrown out in the courts, but they just announced this massive multi-billion-dollar infrastructure thing for the to upgrade JFK Airport that is apparently going to go only to minority groups. And that's industrial policy. And so why, if you want to do that at scale with the whole country, why wouldn't you do that with your little right-wing organization that is trying to get, the guy who wants to do that for the whole country elected president?
Yeah, not little though. I think the Times said their fundraising was at something just short of $50 million a year. So that's
Right.
That's real money. And they bought some 2,200 acre property in Maryland where land is not cheap. I'm stealing from Jonah Goldberg here, who I've heard talk about this on many speeches and podcasts, that the kind of above board rule of law, Western liberal way of doing things, of putting things out to bid and all that, is really the exception.
Right.
What we're seeing with the kind of self-dealing and tribalism and brother-in-law log rolling stuff in the Trump world is really a return to normal. That's not a good return to normal. Normal is not necessarily a good thing. I mean, the normal state of the human being is not great. This stuff is so it can be so brazen. I mean, actually, I don't think I know this better than you, because you've been sort of in the world of political activism and such a lot longer than I have, and you probably had a chance to see some of this stuff. But the case that I always I cherish because it's so wonderful. You couldn't make it up if you were writing a novel. Um, I was working in Philadelphia. I was editing the bulletin there, and one of my reporters came in, and he said, "I want to show you something. This is really interesting. There's this contract going to a firm that no one's ever heard of called Notlum Enterprises, and it's for like $2.5 million or $2 million, and it's to provide consulting services for airport baggage handling services at Philadelphia Airport." And he said, "No one's ever heard of this company." But the mayor at the time is a guy named John Street, and he has a brother named Milton. And if you spell Milton backward, it's Notlin. And he said, surely they're not being so obvious. It's just to spell the mayor's brother's name backward and invent a company and give it a multi-million-dollar contract, which is exactly what they did. And not only was Notlin Enterprises just the mayor's brother, it had no employees or anything like that. Of course, it had no history in airports or baggage handling services or anything like that, or no reason to think they would be good at it. But Milton Street at the time was employed as a hot dog vendor on the streets of Philadelphia. And so they awarded this hot dog vendor a multi-million-dollar contract to help run the airport. And if you've ever been through the Philadelphia airport, you can see that they got their money's worth on that, certainly. It's a bit of a mess of an airport. But the interesting thing about that, I mean, other than just kind of funny Philadelphia corruption stories, is that so we broke that story. I believe we were the first ones to have it. And it was this, embarrassing, shameful thing. Everyone knew it, but it took years of effort to get them to rescind this contract. It was a thing that went on for months and months and months. And then there was litigation. There's all sorts of stuff. And even though it was all out there in the open, everyone could see how corrupt it was. It just went on and on and on and on. And like, that was just how things normally happen, which is how things normally happen in a lot of the world. When I was working at the Indian Express, I remember we had this wonderful, wonderful expose, what became known as fodder scam. Basically, their version of the Secretary of Agriculture was stealing money from this program that was supposed to be used to buy fertilizer for poor farmers in kind of remote and rural areas. And someone had the genius idea of going through the paperwork of this program and looking at its expenditures and running down the vehicles that it was purchasing. Because, they purchased trucks and stuff to drive fertilizer around. They weren't just giving people checks. They're actually delivering the stuff. And, so what they were buying to transport fertilizer in was like a yacht and a Rolls Royce and some other sorts of stuff. So when they finally raided this guy's house, he had, I want to say, $35 million in cash in his house, the equivalent of $35 million. But this was, of course, in Indian rupees when the largest note in circulation was 500 rupees, which was about $12, I guess. So imagine $35 million in $10 bills, what that looks like. He had just stacks and stacks. He had stuff baled up like hay in his house. There were rooms of his house that were just full of stacks of money, like Scrooge McDuck. And it's just normal. It's just how people do things. So these little businesses, like these little, nonprofits that people just use to, give themselves paychecks. It's a pretty common thing. I remember, what was the lady's name? The I'm Not a Witch lady in Delaware.
Christine
O'Donnell.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll look it up. Go on.
Now, I'm not saying that what she was doing was corrupt in any legal way, but I remember after she lost that race, she set up a PAC, and the PAC basically existed just to, give her a job and a budget to do political stuff. And it wasn't really, obviously doing much of anything else. And you see a lot
Christine
of that
O'Donnell.
stuff. O'Donnell, yeah. And, were you there when I had my sort of famous confrontation with Cleta? And
no, we should set that up because it's kind of like Chekhov's gun at this point. We've name dropped her twice and people are like, what are they talking about? So why don't you just sort of start at the beginning and then,
was I'm not a very good extemporaneous public speaker. That's why I write stuff and I don't give speeches. So it was one of my better moments as an extemporaneous public speaker, where it was a National Review cruise, I guess, and it was early in the Trump thing, and she was giving some kind of ridiculous talk about something, and I disagreed with her. And she gave me this thing. Well, you must be one of those inside the Beltway establishment Republicans. And I stopped her and I said, you literally have an office inside the Beltway. You are such a Washington insider that you literally wrote the book on being a lobbyist in DC. It's called the Washington Lobbyist Compliance Handbook. You host a news show on Fox News called The Insiders. You're a regular panelist on it. I don't think you get to talk that way. Like, you're out in Topeka somewhere, running a business and being put upon by the people in DC. And she tried to get me fired from National Review on point. She was on the board of the Bradley Foundation, I guess. And the Bradley Foundation was a small donor to National Review. And she made some noise about that. And so, yeah, I've got some issues with Cleta. She was one of the lawyers who was involved in the Trump coup attempt to...
right. She was on the phone. She's the one who heard talking on the phone with the famous tape of the Georgia one, right?
Yeah. And she left her very prestigious law firm under a little bit of a cloud, although she was never charged with anything, and she has not been disbarred, unlike some of the other lawyers involved in that kind of stuff, which Sarah Isgur gets upset about this every time I say it, but I kind of think every lawyer who worked for the Trump administration should probably be disbarred, or at least the very senior ones should be probably.
I'll push back on that on Sarah's behalf. I mean, just so people know, the reason why Cleta came up is she's named in this New York Times piece.
Yeah. So this nonprofit she was on the board of was spending lots of money on vendors that were controlled by or owned by members of its board or people, insiders at the nonprofit, or members of their families. And she was one of these who was collecting payments.
It's all very incestuous. So, but on the lawyer thing, look, so the only reason I do this is not to sort of defend people who work for the Trump administration, which, as you know, I think is a complicated moral story,
sure,
for the most part. But
I have friends who work for the Trump administration.
But Steve Tellis co-wrote this book about the anti-Trump movement, right? And the chapter, which I've talked about on here a few times, the most interesting sort of, one of the interesting points he makes is how the conservative legal movement weathered the Trump era, or we should now say right now, the first Trump era, better than almost any other faction on the right. And part of their theory is that lawyers have all sorts of rules and procedures and mechanisms in place for dealing with corrupt and terrible clients, right? That's like how they know how to do that. And so they know how to be more transactional without compromising their integrity than the grubbier intellectuals who just love get access, or political activists or political consultants who just go with whatever the client wants, that kind of stuff. There are fewer safeguards for a lot of other people than there are for lawyers who kind of know how to think about this far and no farther. And I think that's largely right. And when you actually look at the lawyers in the Trump administration or in Trump world, more of them, I think, behaved honorably when they needed to than not. And like the standout examples, exceptions to that, are, of course, Jeffrey Clark and John Eastman, and you can make the case for Cleta Mitchell, right? I mean, again, some were in the administration, some were in the periphery. Rudy Giuliani, obviously, and you can go, and that whole four season landscaping crew. But the whole bulk of it really doesn't. But the bulk of the Justice Department guys, Rod Rosenstein, all those guys, they were like, we'll resign en masse if you try to do this stuff, right? And Bill Barr, who's clearly no left winger and no partisan Democrat, as much of a problem as I got with the guy these days, he said flatly to Trump's face, this is all BS. This didn't happen. You're making it up. And so, I mean, my point is that I disagree with you that they should all be disbarred. I don't think Sarah should be disbarred. But moreover, I think this is an important point to make to keep in mind going into a potential second Trump administration, because the kinds of people that we're talking about, these corrupt schmoes or allegedly corrupt schmoes from these various Trumpy quasi think tanks and activist groups and all that kind of stuff, they're very openly saying we don't want those kinds of lawyers anymore.
Yeah.
Right? We don't want Federal Society lawyers. We want lawyers who know what time it is and are willing to sort of break the rules and all the rest. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, making those kinds of distinctions.
The way I think about the lawyers is that there's probably some sanction that goes along with going to work for an administration that had such contempt for the rule of law and main purpose was trying to undermine the rule of law. When you're a lawyer and you go to work for people like that, that's some issue. If there were a whorehouse that had a really, really good bar in it, and you went to the whorehouse,
tell me more.
Sorry, go on. And you just had a cocktail, and you just went and had an old fashioned or two, and your wife would still probably be unhappy about that, right? Because you're not supposed to hang out in whorehouses, and it's just a thing you don't do, even if you're not not taking the situation as far as it could. And I think that working for the Trump administration is like having a cocktail in a whorehouse. Maybe you're not breaking all your vows in life. Maybe you're not breaking all the rules, but you're still in a whorehouse. And there are people, who went to work for the Trump administration the first time around, I think, who had really good intentions, people I know who told me personally, look, these people are crazy and incompetent, but we think that if we're there, we can steer them in the right direction on some things. And that was a theory. How'd that work out? Not great, actually, for most cases. I would argue.
Well, that's not what they'll say. I mean, like from Paul Ryan on down, those guys say. I mean, they say it publicly, but like they'll say, you have no idea how much bad stuff we prevented.
Sure, I mean, there's always that, but also, I mean, you've got, Larry Kudlow is a friend of mine. I like Larry Kudlow. Larry Kudlow and I agree about a lot of stuff. Larry Kudlow is a libertarian economist who went to work for the most protectionist administration since Truman, probably, and made excuses for the stuff that they were doing and did some hand waving and tried to, polish up those turds as best as he could. And, at some point, that kind of thing gets more difficult to defend. And it's certainly going to be a lot more difficult to defend the second time around if there is a second time around.
So that I generally agree with. And I, full disclosure, as you know, my wife hates it when I say this, but she did work for the Trump administration because she worked for Nikki Haley at the UN. And it's getting at the point that you're making here is that whenever I tell people, oh yeah, and my wife worked for the Trump administration, I'm sleeping on the couch that night, because she is really, I worked for Nikki. She's loyal to Nikki. And all that, and anyway, but I get that point. I do think, and there are other people in the economics world in particular, our old colleague Kevin Hassett comes to mind. Sure. People like Steve Moore. It does show you how the demands of politics can overpower the convictions about free market economics. I'll put it as diplomatically and as pleasantly as possible.
Yeah, and the problem is that free market people don't have a lot to sell, right? Libertarians don't have a lot to sell. They don't have goodies to hand out. I did an interview with Art Laffer years and years ago, in which I was pressing him pretty hard on the way in which Republicans misrepresent the Laffer curve and some of his findings, and he was essentially fine with it. He was this is politics, and you have to promise people something that they want to hear. You have to give them a story they like. It's the I forget who calls it the two Santa Claus theory. That the Democrats have Santa Claus.
It's PJ. That was PJ's thing, I think.
Was it? And,
if it's what you're if I'm thinking of what you're describing, I think it was. But go on.
Yeah, and that the Republicans' version of Santa Claus is that we've got these tax cuts that we can give to you, and they don't cost anything. They in fact they pay for themselves. In fact, they more than pay for themselves. And most people know that that's not actually true in most situations. I mean, there are There are theoretical cases and probably some practical cases in which you can find a tax cut that was ultimately revenue positive, but these are pretty rare things, and they're not things that you typically find in the United States in our economy. And there's reasons for that, and everybody who looks at this stuff really very seriously kind of knows that that's true, but they still end up talking about it as though the fiction were the truth, and that's corrupting. It's intellectually corrupting, and then at times it's actually just regular old corrupting, as we've seen in some of these financial self-dealing cases.
Okay, that was not the PJ O'Rourke thing that I was thinking of. He has a whole thing about how God is a Republican and Santa Claus is a Democrat.
Right.
And the only problem is that God exists. But
was PJ a believer? Was PJ a believer?
I believe so.
Huh.
I'm not sure. I know it's a good question. I don't think he was
one way or the other.
Yeah, fair enough. So, but like, I go back and forth on this because you're right. I mean, like, Starwalt makes this point often as well. It's just is that the stuff that you and I really believe in, as a matter of like, not just conviction, but like as what we believe is a description of reality properly, understood, is not popular.
Right.
And it's basically never going to be popular. And I used to, back when I was in good odor on the right, I kind of cornered this market of being cheaper than people like David Brooks and PJ to do sort of funny after dinner speaking, at think tanks, right-wing think tanks and that kind of stuff. And I would always end with like this sort of rousing, not always, but often I would end with this sort of rousing, be a happy warrior thing, because you're always going to be outnumbered by people who think government can love you and all this kind of stuff, and that we're on the side of freedom and we're on the side of the only successful anti-poverty program in human history, which is free market, liberal, democratic capitalism, whatever labels you want to put on it. But you're always going to be outnumbered by people who don't like it. And that message went over really, really well with those groups when I and they both were working on the assumption is that those people were basically on the left or uninformed, but not us right-wingers, right? And it turns out that the desire to be popular is, and we can put fancy labels on it like status and whatever, but the desire to be popular is among the most corrupting things in life. And it's, go ahead.
You've seen this every time you've done a panel discussion in front of a live audience, right? That there's just that desire to play to the audience that some people find really, really difficult to resist.
Yeah. I think that's right.
It's probably best that these cable shows, as bad as they are, think how much worse they would be if there were a live audience there.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely true. I mean, you've heard my theory about this.
Had an audience for a while, didn't it? When he was on Fox News, didn't Glenn Beck show have an audience?
He had every now and then he would do like town hall ones where he would bring people in for sure. But this is, I brought this up before. I first got this idea, credit where it's due, from the Revolutions podcast, which I loved, and I've become obsessed with finding. And if you ever find any examples of this, but like, I look for this often. One of the key differences between the American and French revolutions was that most of our important meetings were done behind closed doors. And the French revolutionaries, even when they were like guys you would sympathize with, more of the Montesquieu flavor than the Babeuf flavor and that kind of stuff, but always having meetings in front of a bunch of drunk Frenchmen where the crowd rewards people who go to rhetorical excess. And then the problem is because they've said these things, they're now bought into this position that makes it impossible to find a compromise and work out, some sort of like, sustainable mode of government kind of thing. The more transparency you have across the board, the more you encourage people to play to audiences rather than actually do what stakeholders and responsible people are supposed to do.
Yeah, it's the tragedy of C-SPAN. This enormously well-intentioned, publicly minded, high-minded, kind of classically liberal thing to do. We're going to open it up and make sure that everyone can see, and just ruined the institution. I mean, it was on the way to ruin anyway, but it accelerated the ruin, I
It
suppose.
accelerated, right? Right.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer that most of our problems are multi-causal, and like Trump accelerated problems that already existed and made
Yeah.
them differences of degree become differences in kind and all that kind of stuff. So,
Speaking of which, a question I've wanted to ask you for a while, and it's a balancing thing. How much do you think Trump brought something into existence versus how much do you think Trump was essentially recruited by a movement that preceded him? So there was already this kind of populist um, mood in the Republican Party. You know, as I always remind people, the whole thing of the Tea Party movement wasn't people looking for alternatives to Democrats. They were looking for alternatives to Republicans. They
mhm.
were, you know, right libertarian people who were unhappy with the state of the Republican Party and thought of the leadership as being contented and corrupt and lazy and all the stuff you hear in the Georgetown cocktail parties and all that. And by the way, still the last Georgetown cocktail party I went to was your 50th birthday, and I've been to one, and I think well, I only ever went to one other one in my whole life. So I'm good on the populist front there, I suppose. So there was this movement already out there, and that I think kind of maybe had enough of a sort of intellectual and moral wake that it sucked Trump into it a little bit. As a guy who was sort of on the sidelines of politics already, who had, you know, played with running for office before, and I guess did run for president once, sort of in a desultory
Mhm.
fashion. I remember when I was working at National Review, I got a call in 2012 from someone who, hi, this is blah, blah, blah with Donald Trump's office, and he's going to run for president this year. Would you like to do an interview with him? And I thought they were prank calling me. And I thought it was a joke at first. And then I thought, no, certainly I'll do the interview. It'll be a lark, you know, it'll be fun. And he ended up not doing it. So I ended up not doing the interview. But I certainly didn't take it seriously. On the other hand, Trump does have, because he's a real celebrity. He's not a political celebrity. He's not a cable news, Fox News
Right.
celebrity. He does have the ability to sort of magic things into existence because celebrity gives you that kind of power. You know, you have a real convening power if you're a real celebrity. You know, people joke about Oprah Winfrey or Taylor Swift or someone running for president, and they shouldn't joke about it because if
Mhm.
that happened, those people would be able to distort the Democratic Party and its politics at least as much as Trump did on the Republican side. So, which do you think it was? Do you think Trump more created something, or do you think he was more created by something that pre-existed him?
So it's an interesting question, and I know where you're coming from on this. You kind of you wrote about this a while back about how basically the GOP was a despotic party looking for a despot, right? Is that fair
Sure,
to
yeah.
characterize your views, right? So like, um, I think there's some of that in there, right? I mean, like, um, I think human beings have a much more pronounced sweet tooth for despotism than we enlightened, you know, first world people like to admit. And it's true on the left and on the right. And, you know, as you like to often say, fish don't know they're wet. People don't see it about their own despots. They only see it about the other side's despots or would be despots. And so I think I was probably a little more blind to it on the right than I should have been. At the same time, if I were writing the history of that period, I am not sure I would make that central. And I'm curious what you think about this, because like I actually think, again, many different causes, overdetermined phenomenon, celebrity is a huge part of it, and all that kind of stuff. And we can go down a list of the various factors. You know, I think that and it's worth pointing this out just because we just found out yesterday that the Tea Party is now basically officially dead with the end
Yeah.
of Freedom Works closing up because it can't exist in the Trump era is basically how they explained it. So it's worth dwelling on this for a second. I think there are a lot of people on the right who had basically a psychic break because of the treatment of the Tea Parties. These were people who, yeah, there were some, of course there were loonies, because loonies will always show up where there are big crowds and lots of political energy. But
Mm-hmm.
the median Tea Party person was actually a pretty good, decent American who was freaked out by the financial crisis, freaked out by the idea of of bailing out all of these, you know, fat cat bankers, and their core messaging was about getting back to basics, living within our means, all that kind of stuff. And they carried around the Constitution, and they talked about Friedrich Hayek and all that kind of stuff. And they cleaned up after themselves at protests, and they got permits. They did everything basically the right way. And they were all called Nazis and fascists and racists anyway. And the media was so unbelievably contemptuous and dishonest about it that I think a lot of those people said, well, they're going to call us that no matter what. We might as well lean into this stuff. And I'm not saying that's true for everybody, but I think it was one of the dynamics. But the thing I wanted to get to is I actually think the factor that I think is more important than the wanting a despot thing, although it plays into it, is I think Fox News, because it was uncontested for almost 2 decades, right? As the 800-pound gorilla, the issue framer, the messaging machine of the right, it incepted New York City style populism into American politics. We normally think of populism as like this thing that William Jennings Bryan does in Nebraska, but there's always been a bridge and tunnel populism, outer boroughs versus inner boroughs, and Rudy Giuliani scratched the itch of the despot thing. That's why I think there's a connection here. And if you go through like the Eric Bollings and the Sean Hannitys and the Bill O'Reillys, and you go down these lists, it's an enormous number of people who like grew up in Long Island or New Jersey, or now lived in Long Island or New Jersey, and they had this nostalgic golden age understanding of what New York used to be. And Rudy Giuliani proved that you could restore it. And it's sort of like, the most ardent nationalists are the ones who grew up abroad. Sure. They're ones who are just outside the fishbowl saying, I could be as authentic as those guys. And
zeal of a convert.
Yeah. And so Trump, very effectively, because he was utterly immersed in a product of that culture, he was always the hero of the outer borough people and hated by the Manhattan people, tapped into that sort of Fox populism, that Fox bridge and tunnel populism, and scaled it at a national level. And I think that that's sort of the cultural thing that a lot of people missed, is that Fox was never that conservative. It was populist, right-wing, much like the New York Post in the city. Yeah, it's right-wing, but it's always been much more populist in its sort of appeal, tots falling down a well, hero cop, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, what do you think of all that?
Yeah, I never really thought about Fox News as injecting a particularly New York view of politics and populism into the conversation, although that makes a lot of sense. I've often thought that a sort of crack up on the right really started with 9/11, because it was traumatic for one thing, but also because it brought a lot of people into political activism who weren't people who kind of grew up with it. So there were a lot of people who felt kind of a cultural valence and kinship to the Republican Party and sort of a right-wing view of the world, but who didn't really have, the kind of philosophical grounding. They hadn't read the books. They weren't National Review readers. They weren't, the people who had Bill Buckley's The Jeweler's Eye at home and any of that sort of stuff. And they came into politics, and a lot of these people were people from traditionally Democratic areas like New York and the big cities. I saw a lot of that in Philadelphia, where there was a resurgence after 9/11 of what you might call Rizzoism, of sort of, Frank Rizzo kind of school of politics, which is big on like sort of celebrating police brutality and that kind of thing, the way Trump does. So yeah, I suppose maybe,
I mean, the Giuliani time stuff was, like.
Yeah, so I guess it's a real confluence of things, because you've got Fox News and 9/11 and that 9/11 school of politics kind of happening.
Right. And 9/11 is what makes Fox News, right? I mean, that's the turbocharge.
And then you get, essentially the rise of social media a few years after that, with the introduction of the iPhone in, what was that, 2011? Something like that. So, Yeah, just a weird confluence of things that any one of them by itself might have been politically significant, but all of them together really kind of changed both the Republican Party and the conservative movement, and I guess the country as a whole. Um, the conspiracy stuff and the kind of weird fringy politics, as you probably know, because I mean, especially you had a father who was in journalism syndicates, and they got all sorts of crazy weird letters and stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of thing was around for a long. Well, also having the name Goldberg, probably you get to see a lot more of that than the average person does. Um, that stuff was around. I remember it from when I was a kid, like in the middle '80s, when it was done by mass faxes. And if you had a fax machine, you would occasionally get a fax from somebody that you didn't know. And if you were a business, I mean, we'd have a fax machine at the Williamson household, and we barely had electricity. But and there were these mass faxes that would be like, sort of Bircher stuff or neo-Nazi stuff, or kind of oh gosh, who's the guy who went to prison on tax charges who runs for
LaRouche?
president? Yeah, LaRouche.
Lyndon
I'm trying to
LaRouche?
think of LaRouche or stuff. And people would sort of hand it around furtively, like pornography. And but the technological means for communicating that stuff was so limited that it really it kept its reach from being wide enough to kind of
Right.
normalize it.
That's why
And
Ron
I
Paul
wrote an
had those
essay.
newsletters, remember?
Yeah, I wrote an essay a while back. It was a few years ago that made a lot of people angry, and it was about. I've always hated the phrase. People write about normalizing Donald Trump or normalizing this or that, and I wrote that there's no such thing as normalizing Donald Trump. He doesn't need to be normalized. He is absolutely normal. This is, he is as American as diabetes. He's American as a fentanyl overdose. He is, he is the embodiment of something that's very deeply imprinted in our culture, in our national psyche, in our way of doing things, our way of being in the world. I mean, there's been a Donald Trump sort of figure in every generation. Some of them have been better, some have been worse. The real genius of Trump in 2016 was running essentially the Ross Perot campaign, but inside the Republican Party rather than as a doomed third party candidate. That stuff's always been there, but we're now more connected in ways that make it seem more. I guess it seems less shocking because we're so deep dipped in it now that we spend so much time with it. So, 1988, if someone handed you some mimeographed neo-Nazi pamphlet, I mean, there wouldn't be anything in there that would surprise you exactly. It'd be the Protocols, the Elders of Zion, and all that stuff. And
Right.
Jewish bankers run the world, and it's the Rothschilds and all that. But it felt weird. It would be this kind of like strange feeling artifact that you'd be uncomfortable handling. But now it's just, I mean, I don't know what your email looks like and your social media mentions look like. I imagine they're pretty gross. But I know what mine looks like. And it's just, it's 7, 8, 9, 10 of these things a day. And and that's just what the junk mail filter doesn't get.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I think this sort of gets at this. So I was having a conversation recently with a very prominent former Republican of politician, just leave it at that. And he was hopeful that once Trump is gone from the scene by one means or another, Republican Party is going to snap back to normal. And I wasn't quite, oh, you sweet summer child, but I was like, it's going to be more work than that, right? I do think there's a very strong case that, because like Trump imitators don't do well, right? And they don't have the, like, say what you will, and you wrote a really devastating piece about J.D. Vance. Like, J.D. Vance is no Donald Trump, for good or for ill. Like, he doesn't appeal to people the same way. He's too earnest, all that kind of stuff. When he fakes it, he seems fake, all that. And you can say that about all of them, right? And Matt Gaetz is a jerk in a way that Donald Trump is a jerk, but like people notice it about Matt Gaetz. And so I do think with Trump out of the picture, a lot of Republicans will feel much more empowered to actually defend normalcy and principles and all that. And when you saw the Republican debates, it was really remarkable how, with the exception of Vivek, they all argued with each other basically within the goalposts of mainstream Reaganite conservatism. Emphasized different things, but like they thought policy mattered. They were free market, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's where the GOP's muscle memory is. Where I think things are just irretrievably different is this point that you're getting at, which is that, I'm a little older than you, but 10, 15 years before we were born, basically, if William F. Buckley or George Will or any of those kinds of people said, this person's a crackpot, that was it for them. Like, they weren't going to get on TV, right? There weren't enough TV. There were only 4 TV channels, 5 TV channels. They weren't going to get an op-ed in the New York Times. The gatekeepers had institutional heft to man the gates. And now
it turns out that was valuable.
And it turns out it was extremely valuable because, again, that hoary thing about transparency and democratization has real downsides, and we can get into that. But like the ability for people to just skip any gatekeepers and vomit nasty stuff straight into people's lives on Twitter, on Facebook, and so all over the place, and on these competing cable news channels, and Lord knows what's going on YouTube, Rumble, and all that kind of stuff, is that there are no, like I was telling this politician, like, even if I had the skills and the talent and the wisdom and all that kind of stuff, there's no way I could be Charles Krauthammer today, right? Because no one wants a Charles Krauthammer. No one wants someone who is a legitimizer, a argument settler, an anathematizer, right? A gatekeeper. They don't want gatekeepers. And that's a function of media as much as anything else, because it makes populism, it lowers the barrier to entry for populists in ways that I don't think can ever be repaired.
Yeah. I wonder if the Republican Party is reparable, or if, parties, of course, mean less than they used to. It's something you especially have been voluminous
Obsessive
in
about.
talking about, and very useful, I think, as well. I've enjoyed your work on that. That's not just kissing up to my friend. But what year was it that Strom Thurmond ran for president? The Dixiecrat, was that 1940?
48. That was the year for people. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was Norman Thomas, Truman, Dewey, right, and Thurmond.
So when he ran that campaign, which is weird for a lot of reasons, I don't want to get into the whole Strom Thurmond thing, but people were surprised at the time because he had previously been seen as sort of a moderate on racial stuff. He was a segregationist, but he was someone who tried to avoid like inflammatory language and some of the more really confrontational versions of that. Anyway, but it seems like when he ran for president that time around, the Democratic Party had a big disagreement about a very important issue, but it was still kind of a coherent thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then, a couple of decades later, when you get Wallace, it's obvious that whatever Wallace is something that can no longer live in the Democratic Party. He's going somewhere else. Now, he ended up back and forth to the Democratic Party, but he represented a thing that was new and separate and irreconcilable. And I wonder if, we may never get the chance to figure out whether Trumpism is actually something that's irreconcilable with the Republican Party, because it's really just consumed it. I think the real question is, whatever the Republican Party used to be, is that reconcilable with what the party has become? So I guess Trump is different in the sense that he didn't speak for what ended up being a minority position in the Republican Party. He ended up speaking for what ended up being now a majority position in the Republican Party. But I don't know that I think that there's a way to put these two things back together. I'm not sure they need to be put back together. The problem for people like us, of course, is that leaves us really without a political vehicle. People who are center-right, classical liberal, American founding sort of people don't really have a political party. It's not probably going to be the Democratic Party. It's probably not ever going to be the Republican Party again. And it may just be that there's a position, an era of dormancy coming for those ideas, which worries me some, because I think they're necessary. I don't think the country really works without them. They don't have to constantly be in power. The American kind of tradition lived through Woodrow Wilson, cue that music. It lived through the New Deal and all of these very anti-liberal, I don't use the word anti-American like in a cheap demagogic sort of way here, but these programs that were just kind of fundamentally at odds with the American way of doing things and the American tradition and the American system. They were much more European kind of programs. The fact that the regular sort of traditional American constitutional ideas were still out there and still active in politics kept the country from completely going off the rails and ended up being in a sort of Spanish Civil War situation, or or England in the 70s, where you've really kind of devolved into something that's unrecognizable from what the country used to be. But if we have 20 years where essentially the kinds of ideas that you and I advocate have no purchase and not much of a public hearing, it is possible that people forget about them, or that so many people forget about them that they're not in a position to come back when there's a vacuum for them to come back into. I do worry about that. I worry that we invested so much on the right in the Republican Party and in the kind of familiar organs of the conservative movement that once these things got captured and broken and distorted, we didn't have a good plan B. And I guess we're still looking around for a plan B.
So this is a good question for you. So libertarians and anarcho-capitalists, which I think you've called yourself both at one point or another, they have, it's both a curse and a luxury.
Anarcho-capitalist, I have intellectual sympathies with that, and I think it's a very persuasive and compelling set of ideas. It's not something that I would embrace as a political platform in 2024. But.
Sure. But my point is that, our friends at Reason and those kinds of places, it's both a curse and a luxury of not having a team to explicitly root for in a way that, the New Republic rooted for Democrats, and National Review, God love them, rooted for Republicans. And although it's always worth pointing out, that's not how National Review started, right? I mean, National Review started out with a healthy tension with the Eisenhower administration and all that. But the question I have is and I want to say this very respectfully, because I'm describing some of my closest friends and some people I deeply respect and I think are good and serious people and all that kind of stuff. But it's like when you learn a new word and all of a sudden you hear it all over the place. When you get, or and you're partly responsible for this, is like when you realize people are using less and fewer wrong. Whenever you hear it, it just takes you out of the moment, and you're like, damn it, or begs the question, that kind of thing.
Me and Game of Thrones.
Yeah, fair. I was probably as guilty of this as basically anybody, who I respect out there for most of my career, that when I would talk about Republicans in electoral contests, policy fights, all that kind of stuff, I would talk about them the way a Packers fan talks about the Packers. Like, we did this.
Yeah.
We're going to win this one, right? And so part of my theory has been for a while that one of the things that got the conservative movement into trouble, or the conservative intellectual class into trouble, is part of the unspoken job description of being a conservative intellectual is to be a de facto political consultant for the Republican Party. Here's what you got to do to win. Here's what we need to do to win. Come to the Republican candidate's defense, where the priority is to defend the candidate and then come up with the arguments to do it, rather than let the merits of the arguments drive you to defend the candidate. And now when I hear that, because I am sufficiently alienated from the Republican Party, it sets my teeth on edge. And I hear it all the time, including, again, from friends, former colleagues, people I admire and respect. I'll lapse into it from time to time, and I try to correct myself. And I don't think you've ever been guilty of that, because you've always been much more of a...
I've always had the Republican Party at arm's length.
Yeah, much more than I did for a long time. And it's not to say that I was like a wildly rah-rah partisan guy. I criticized the hell out of George W. Bush. But I think that's another part of this thing that we're getting at about the transformation of the GOP, is like, if they made a I don't know, if they just went down to the docks and found a pimp and made him the standard bearer of the Republican Party, it would cause a similar crisis for a lot of people. Well, look, pimps are basically, they're important middlemans in a service economy and blah, 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 right? I mean, like, people will bend to defend their team's guy.
Call that a step in the right direction, but go ahead.
So I'm just wondering, like, do you think part of the answer is going to be you need another generation of people who are sufficiently estranged from the party to help with this stuff, or is all lost, I guess, is where I'm coming.
There are a few things going on there, I think. I was just thinking probably the height of my Republican partisanship would have been right after 9/11, George W. Bush administration. Maybe it was a Texas thing, although I don't think maybe that's it. I'll tell you what it probably was the anti-war stuff. And anytime I see this sort of, hippie rabble lined up on one side of a barricade, I just instinctively want to be on the other side of it. And which is not a particularly intellectually defensible way to go about conducting your politics, but that's probably a big part of it for me. But yeah, I mean, my first presidential vote was for Andre Maru, the libertarian candidate in 1992. What, did you vote for Maru?
I voted for Maru, 92.
It turned out not to be great in some ways, but that's neither here nor there. I was actually talking to our friend Jay Norlinger about this not long ago, sort of the history of my partisanship, because Jay was thought of himself as more of a rah-rah Republican guy for years, and of course
for sure
now is not. So something you've been really good about talking about, and I think people get a hard time getting this through their heads, that there's a difference between what we do and what political campaign managers do and political consultants do. And it would be better if people understood that they were one or the other, that, you're a writer or you're a journalist or you're an intellectual or you're a professor or you're a campaign manager or you're a candidate. And then these are just very different things. And there's overlap, obviously, between these things. There are people like Podhoretz was on the podcast the other day, on your podcast today, talking about his time as a speechwriter in the White House and Reagan administration, right? And for a few months.
And then carried over into the H.W. Bush administration briefly. Yeah.
So people do move kind of back and forth, but they're very different things. And but it's the audience capture thing you were talking about earlier. I remember how I decided I had to leave National Review way back when, before I came to the Dispatch, when I went to the Atlantic. I was at a National Review event out in California, and a bunch of very nice people. But as the evening progressed and the drinks were consumed, the crowd turned on me a little bit, and someone demanded of me very angrily, what are you doing to help get Republicans elected?
Yeah.
And I told her, well, nothing. I mean, it's not what I do. It's not my job. I probably wouldn't be very good at it anyway, because I'm not exactly, Mr. Pulse on the finger of what the man on the street wants. And of course, I made the mistake then of calling up Jeffrey Goldberg and saying, hey, I'm probably going to need a job here in a couple of months. Let's talk. And that didn't work out exactly as planned, but that's okay. But, when people start thinking of people like you and me as being people whose job it is to get people elected, we have to push back against that, obviously, but also we probably have to tell ourselves that particular sort of audience is lost to us. That if what people really, really care about is I need to get someone who belongs to my team with an R next to his name elected to the city council in San Antonio, and that's the main thing that matters, then we just don't have a lot to say to those people. We have a lot to say about a lot of other things, but they don't care about that stuff. And that's fine. Not everybody has to care about everything. So there probably needs to be some disaggregation of responsibilities and talents and interests and those things. Everyone can go ahead and assume that there's a footnote here on the name Sam Francis, and we can talk about what a crackpot he turned out to be later in life. But one of his arguments early on, and I think Michael Brendan Doherty's written about this. He did a big piece about Sam Francis, I guess, a few years ago, was that Francis thought that conservatives cared too much about ideas and not enough about power, and that we should think more about how power is actually achieved and wielded and maintained. And there probably is something to that. The left had great success with the long march through the institutions. It really did matter that they ended up controlling things like seminaries and universities and HR departments, and of course the major media and all the stuff we could talk about. that stuff really ended up mattering. And that's a real form of power that people, I think, don't appreciate until they find themselves on the receiving end of it. And conservatives have not been as successful at that. We've been more successful at building counter institutions. But those are not. Again, I'll go back to this guy Jonah Goldberg, who I've read a lot. That you can't start a new Harvard, right? You can't create new old things. These things that have been there for a long time matter for various reasons. And but the people who are good at thinking about and doing the business of achieving and wielding power in an effective way are generally not the same people who are good at doing the other stuff, at the ideas people, and trying to do what you and I do, I think, which is try to explain the world to people and try to help them understand it from a certain point of view.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. One of the best illustrations of the corrupting of power of sort of partisanship and populism and stuff. Heritage Foundation used to do these first principles conferences where they would go around the country, and I spoke at a couple of them. It's the usual suspects talking about the founders and the role of the Constitution or free market economics, and and a bunch of people show up, and it's like taking a little class kind of thing. And the problem was that, and I saw it firsthand, is like the lady who went up to you and said, "What are you doing to get Republicans elected?" People would say, "This is all great, but what are you going to do to get Republicans elected?" And so Heritage created Heritage Action, so that less to sort of answer that question on the merits and more to get their credit card numbers. But like they thought the two went together in their mind. And then for a long time, Heritage Action became the tail that wagged the dog at Heritage. And now basically the spirit of Heritage Action is the Heritage Foundation. And it's the organizations, the institutions that went the most Trumpy earliest and the most surprisingly were always talk radio and the public facing part of Hillsdale, Heritage Foundation, these institutions that depend upon large mass customer or donor bases. And when there go the people, I must go with them, for I am their leader kind of thing kicks in. And
there's something to be said for significant immediate financial feedback. It's really effective.
But yeah, it's like if we were food critics, we would run into fewer people saying, "What are you going to do to get Joe Biden elected?" Right? You still would run into them because everything's becoming so politicized, but fewer of them. And but because we write about politics and ideas and political stuff, people assume that we're doing it as a surrogate for a party. And I do think this sort of gets to, we don't have to dwell on it because I'm probably going to have more profound comments about it later, but like the differences between the Dispatch and the Bulwark. The Bulwark is basically committed to this idea of being a player in elections and in politics and putting its thumb on the scale. Doesn't mean everything they do is without merit or anything like that, but like they want to be, they have one foot in the political activist world and one foot in the sort of journalism world, and the two coordinate with each other. And at the Dispatch, we want nothing to do with any of that stuff. And some of our subscribers are mad at us about it. And other subscribers get it. And it's a tension. It's a difficult thing to explain to people because that's where the culture is. It's getting back to the what's normal and what's not normal. What we're doing is abnormal. What the nation does or Mother Jones does or whatever, to like support a party kind of thing. That's normal in our current political climate, and explaining to people that we have a different lane. They can't, a lot of people can't hear it or can't understand it or do understand it and reject it because the stakes are just too high.
Yeah, I think that part of that's just work, it's more work to dig through the intellectual stuff and it's not as much fun. It's not a game show, it's not the Packers. to use an unusual and rare sports metaphor for me, because it's not really my thing. I was a pretty good football player, just never enjoyed watching.
I can see that.
Right tackle, big and slow. Could remember the plays. That's all we really need to do to be a right tackle. And for the losingest 5A football team in Texas history, I should point out, we were the worst. Literally the losingest 5A football team in Texas history at that point. We were everyone's homecoming game. It was a mess. But that's a
You're the Washington Generals of Texas high school football. That's the team that plays the Harlem Globetrotters.
Short version of this. So I played in the league in the year that the famous book Friday Night Lights was written about.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't actually play Permian that year because I wasn't. I went back and forth between JV and the other one, but I think they beat us 88-0 or something. But I went to this nerd school. We had a really good chess team and a really good women's gymnastics team and a terrible high school football team. So we lost every game for just season after season after season after season. We had this whole tradition of cheers that were made up about how bad our team was and that stuff. And I'll never forget, this is after my junior year, I decided I wasn't going to play football anymore. And I went to tell the coach that I was not going to come back next year. And he was just confused. I mean, he wasn't even angry. He didn't understand why, if you got a chance to play football, you wouldn't play football. And I said, well, I think I'm going to, spend more time working on the school newspaper. And he said, well, what the hell do you expect to come of that? I said, well, I don't know, but I don't think I'm probably headed to the NFL. And I'm probably not even good enough to play at UT. I definitely wasn't good enough to play at UT. So anyway, that's my sorry football career. Although I was a very good wrestler and won a bunch of stuff.
Look, I played Division III basketball in college as a 6'3" dude on a campus with only a couple dozen dudes. Like I was qualified. It was not very good. We were not.
I didn't know you were a basketball player.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fun.
My wife was a good basketball player. She was like a star high school basketball player.
Yeah, and, I mean, she was a sporty type. Yeah.
Actually played against Sarah Palin in high school at one point.
Who won?
So like we should get back to the original point, but it was funny. So
we're well into the second hour, so it's a good reveal, I think.
You remember that momentary, just absolute hysteria about Palin when she got picked, and everyone was just going nuts about her, pro or con, and all that kind of stuff. Jess we had both met Palin on a Hillsdale cruise, and then on a National Review cruise, right? Because that was that time when the circuits were going up there, and she held court with everybody, and they talked Alaska, and it was interesting. The first thing that Sarah Palin said to my wife when she said, "I'm from Alaska," the first thing Sarah Palin said to her was, "How did you get out?" Which was an interesting tell. And so like they figured out that they had at least one game against each other, and like Alaska basketball is weird because like a lot of the away games are by plane to get to these places because the state's so big. And but anyway, and then they would sleep on like the gym floor at some other high school. But like, so
there's bears and ice and stuff,
Yeah, all that stuff. So like word gets out that Jess, who had written for the Standard and had written books and was a speechwriter and all that, had played basketball against Sarah Palin. And like she gets calls from like Richard Starr at the Standard at the time saying, "Could you do like a 5,000 word piece on what it was like to play basketball against Sarah Palin?" and I'm probably being a little unfair to Starr, but it was those kinds of calls. And like Jess was like, I don't even remember what she looked like. And the idea that I'm going to stretch it out to like, I could tell by the way she charged the hoop that she was going to be a hero on Tax Cuts, just like there's nothing there to write about. But anyway, interesting times. What were we talking about before?
$5 a word.
Yeah, then for sure you could come up with something to say. But and I should, full disclosure, my wife worked on Sarah Palin's second book. I'm not sure Palin read it, but she didn't brag about shooting any dogs either. So there's that. So, how why did you bring up the Packers in your football metaphor that derailed us? Do you remember? I don't remember.
The sportsy kind of thinking about stuff, the my team versus
Rooting
the
for a
other team
team.
is a lot
Yeah.
easier way to engage with public affairs than, reading Hayek is.
Yeah. And also, to take that analogy a little bit further, it's like people understand that sports writers actually can't affect what's going to happen on the field in a significant way for the most part, right? I mean, they're not going to when they write, they're not like, if you change the crowd's mind about a player, that's going to change things, whatever. But they think that, like, you and I and people like us and our class of professionals, that if we write about something, that will change politics in a significant way. And I like to think that can happen from time to time, and it helps you get out of bed in the morning. But I would rather people had I'm a sports writer writing about sports, the sports version of politics, than thinking I'm like actually on the team and can effectuate.
Yeah, and no one ever said to, some columnist for Sports Illustrated, well, why don't you go down there and be the quarterback?
Right.
Which
right.
we kind of get a lot of. Why don't you run for office? Well,
right.
I have to explain why I haven't voted in 30 years. 25.
All right. So,
big yawn there, Jonah. Does that mean the conversation's coming to a close?
No. We're at an hour and 16 minutes on this thing, and we've managed to studiously avoid anything actually really in the news, except for a allegedly corrupt, hack outfit that's supporting Trump. I did, I'm a big believer that if I raise an issue, I should make sure it gets put back to bed, for listeners who are like, you never got back to that thing, because I hate getting those emails. Just sort of quickly, in the grand spirit of burying the lead, Biden announced yesterday that the reporting is clear. He waited to make this announcement about withholding sending weapons to Israel until after he could give his not terrible Holocaust Remembrance Day speech about how he's backing Israel to the hilt and anti-Semitism is bad. And then he's like, yeah, but in an interview on CNN on Wednesday night, he says Israel's been targeting civilians and we're not going to give them weapons and they can't go into Rafah with our weapons. Some of our friends are apoplectic about this. I'm pretty pissed off about it. As I said on the Dispatch podcast a minute ago, or an hour and something minutes ago, it kind of reminds me of Talleyrand's thing about it's not even a crime, it's a mistake. Like, the infuriating thing about it to me is that, like, even if you're okay with the policy is clearly being driven by politics, and the political decision strikes me as incredibly stupid. Like, Biden's going to lose more support than gain in this, and he's throwing Israel under the bus in the process. So I just don't get it. But, like, that's how I feel about it. Where do you come down on it?
Yeah, I think the United States is overestimating its influence. Obviously, we are an important ally for Israel, and obviously we are the senior partner in the relationship, being a large and very powerful country, and Israel being a small and not very powerful country. That being said, part of this is about Netanyahu and this weird thing where we read the American relationship with Israel and the UK and a few other countries and Canada through our own partisan lens. So we Republicans like the UK better when they've got a conservative prime minister, and they like Canada better when they've got a conservative prime minister. And people who don't know anything about Canadian politics, but who are sort of culturally on the right, have very strong opinions about people like Justin Trudeau, because he's just the wrong kind of person. So people on the American left who don't really know anything about Israeli politics or Israel in general have really strong feelings about Netanyahu. And that's part of this. Part of it is, of course, old-fashioned anti-Semitism, which is more of a live political issue in the Democratic Party than it is in the Republican Party for historical reasons. Partly because it's a more it's a more prominent theme of black politics in big cities. Anti-Semitism is just much more part of that politics, which has to do with, Nation of Islam and other sorts of stuff. But if you read I spent years reading the black newspapers in Philadelphia, and there would be crazy anti-Semitic stuff in there that you just, you wouldn't get in the equivalent kind of, right-wing publications. And also because Arab Americans tend to support Democrats more than they do Republicans. So there's not necessarily anti-Semitism in that, but certainly an anti-Israel sentiment that's attached to that. That being said, the Israelis are going to do what they're going to do. They killed a whole bunch of people in horrible, horrible ways. There's still hostages there. They're going to do what any other country would do, and they're going to stomp these guys into oblivion to the extent that they can. And I don't think that anything the Biden administration says or does is really probably going to stop that, short of sending, troops to stop the Israelis from going into Rafah, which is not going to happen, obviously. The Israelis have to do this. You can't leave Hamas standing. That doesn't mean you have to, kill every single person who's ever been on a letterhead for a Hamas branch office somewhere, but you have to smash them as an organization. You have to end them as an organization, the way the United States essentially did with Al-Qaeda after 9/11. And I think that the Israelis probably will do that. You and John were talking about, you and Padoris were talking about the other day, there is this misunderstanding that among some people in the American political world, that if someone other than Netanyahu were in power, that this would come out differently, which is probably not the case.
Right.
There are politicians who are far to the left of him in Israel who would be prosecuting the war in more or less the same way. Biden, because he is a not very smart guy and because he's always been politically very cowardly, says a lot of dumb things that no one takes seriously. So I guess yesterday he said that, we can't have a situation in which the Israelis endanger any civilians in Rafah, which is just nonsense, of course. There's no way to fight a war in an urban area without endangering some civilians. You can take steps, and the Israelis have taken extraordinary steps to minimize the loss of life among civilians and innocent third parties, but there's no way to take it to zero. And Biden says those sorts of things without meaning it. It's just the way people in politics just have these kind of weird word salad things they say that are just sort of rote ritual pronunciations that don't actually have any effect on the real world. I don't think that in the long term there's much of a likelihood that the practical aspects of our security relationship with Israel are going to change very much. We're going to continue to support them militarily in various kinds of ways. The Israelis are going to continue to be able to arm themselves with or without our help. It doesn't really matter whether we want to participate in that or not. They've got sufficient resources to do that on their own. There are lots of people who can sell them weapons, and if we don't, other people certainly will. And but I don't think we're going to stop doing that either, because it's the sort of radical change that seems like it's something that's likely to happen while passions are very hot and the headlines are going on. But 6 months from now, 9 months from now, 18 months from now, when things have cooled off a little bit, I expect that things will very much go back to normal, because that's what things tend to do.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think the thing that is kind of infuriating about it is that the people who, first of all, it's wildly exaggerated, the number of people who care to the point where they're going to vote on the issue, care about the Middle East, right? I mean, we just had Axios just put out a poll of college kids, and of the 9 issues that was the most important issue, conflict in the Middle East came in dead last.
Yeah.
And only 13% said it was the number one issue. And that leaves out the fact that some of those people who say it's the number one issue are pro-Israel, right? I mean, because it's not necessarily that all 13% are, supportive of Hamas or, the Palestinians generally. And so, but the people who do really care about that stuff, this decision by Biden isn't going to win over their votes, right? I mean, like, they're not going to forgive him for this stuff. And it's not like Dearborn's not moving back into his column in any way. And so the damage done to the sense that that when something like this happens to an ally and we say we're going to back you to the hilt and then we don't, that has long-lasting moral hazard for American foreign policy. And if Israel goes into Rafah, right, without precision bombs, more Palestinians will die, not fewer. And if Israel is successful in crushing Hamas in Rafah, they can declare victory, and Biden can't, because he said, I didn't want anything to do with it, right? And so I don't get where the sort of strategery is here. That I'd be perfectly fine if this was a cynical ploy, if I understood why the cost-benefit analysis rewarded the cynicism. But it seems like a weird mix of virtue signaling and process mongering. Like they the whole cookie pusher talking is better than anything, and all that kind of stuff, and process capture, and playing to constituencies that they care about that they shouldn't. And so if this was a move to guarantee he was going to win the presidency, I'm not saying I would agree with it, but I would process it with less rage, right? And I guess that's my point.
Well, Biden's not good at politics. I think he's kind of, Chauncey Gardner his way into the presidency, but, he's been in politics for 50 years. He, a little bit more. He first entered elected office the year I was born. And now, if you had said to someone 20 years ago, Joe Biden's going to be the most important man in American politics in 2024,
right?
Nobody would have believed you. He'd been in politics for 30 years at that point. He's not very good at this stuff. I think that the thing that will really matter in the long run is that this will change the kind of emotional and psychological nature of our relationship with Israel, particularly on Israel's side. So you could take a country like, Austria. Austria knows, well, we're a NATO member. We've got this alliance with the United States. If someone invades Austria, the United States will come to our defense. We've got this relationship. But no one in Vienna thinks, well, the Americans love us. No one in Vienna thinks the Americans really care about us. They want to see us thrive. They're just like, oh, we're just another country in Europe to them, and Mozart, whatever. And they don't have this kind of a sort of intimate emotional relationship that you have between many Americans, Jewish Americans, evangelical Christians, and other people who just kind of admire Israel for being this scrappy, decent, good little country that's achieved amazing things in a part of the world where amazing things are hard to achieve. And the Israelis thought we had that kind of relationship with them. A lot of Israelis thought that. And that we cared about them on some personal kind of level, even though we don't have the kind of formal legal mutual defense relationship with them that we have with a lot of other countries.
So the way a lot of people feel about the British, right? They're just they're kind of cousins kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people in Israel now must be looking at the United States and saying, these are not the people we thought they were. At least some of them are. And if it were just some kids on some college campus screaming and being stupid, it would be one thing. But these kids apparently have the ear of the president and the president of the more liberal, more progressive party in the United States. And that's got to have a long-term effect on how particularly younger Israelis, people maybe in their 20s and 30s who are actually doing the fighting right now and who have probably the closest connection to much of the recent horror, because it wasn't, people in their 70s at that concert for the most part. And they're going to be looking at their relationship with the United States, I think, differently for many, many years to come. And that's going to be a real loss for us, I think, because while we don't have a lot of allies in that part of the world, we have even fewer friends.
Yeah. All right. On that note, because Adam's going to kill me to go 90 minutes on the day that we have to turn this around the same day. Kevin Williamson, thank you for doing this. And obviously, we'll have you back. One of the few places where I can say it's a command performance if necessary. And congrats with the Brood.
Thank you.
It's a source of major excitement within triplet stuff, is a source of major enthusiasm among the staff. So, I
feel like I abuse the dispatch Slack a little bit with too many pictures.
I've never heard a single complaint. So, And that's it. So thanks again.